Hello, and welcome to Collapse Club, where our topic is how are we to live in the time of collapse? I'm David Baum in Seattle, and with me today from Australia is Margi Prideaux. Hello, Margi.
Hello, David.
Margi has written a book, Fire. It is an account of the Black Summer of 2019 and 2020 on Kangaroo Island in Australia. Margi, could you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to write this book?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me to be here, David. It's an honor to be part of this and an honor to be part of the collective knowledge that's coming from your channel. So I'm thrilled. I come from 25 to 30 years of environmental advocacy as a professional. So I've been working on environmental campaigns for most of my working life. It is my second career, but most of my working life has been spent as an advocate and an activist. And in fact, I've even been a climate change activist in that time. And I thought that I knew the measure of what was happening, and I thought that I understood how the world worked. And then Black Summer swept across Australia, and there were hundreds of fires. Literally, the entire southern part of Australia was on fire through that period. And part of that was a devastating fire that hit my own community and hit my husband and I, and destroyed much of our lives, much of what we had built and much of what we thought we understood. And as a writer, in the aftermath of that, I felt a duty to speak on behalf of my community, but also a duty to speak with clarity to the conservation movement and to the world about how unprepared we are and how blinkered we are about what it is that's happening to the world, how quickly we forget about catastrophes, and how quickly we slip into denial about what the rolling impact of climate change is right now. So
In your book, I'm sorry.
That came out as fire. Yeah.
In your book, you described the fire as something that had never been seen before, something on a scale that was totally unfamiliar to anyone who lived in Australia. Could you talk about your experience of the fire itself?
Well, Black Summer happened on the back of 10 years of really deep, gripping drought. But what we had not understood as the fire season approached, when I say we, I mean the general public, is just how dry the landscape was. You tend to think dry is dry, but once vegetation starts drying out to extreme levels, its fire danger increases exponentially. And so we had a fire that had never been experienced before because we had a drought and a heat wave that had never been experienced before, conflated by climatic conditions that meant that the winds that hit during the fire storms, that it wasn't just Kangaroo Island, it was across Australia, propagated what are called pyrocumulus clouds, which are basically climate events where the sky is on fire. And the devastation of that is so huge. It's of a scale, almost incomprehensible to the human brain. It's not just a bit of fire creeping across the ground towards your house or maybe even hurtling through trees. It's a fire smashing across an entire landscape in seconds. That's what we lived through, and there were lives lost. There were lives lost across Australia. There were lives lost in my own community. But there was also absolute devastation to wildlife and farm animals, to timbered areas, to bushland, to forests, 89 homes, hundreds of farm buildings, which we're in a rural farming community. The impact was just of a scale that we could not quite fathom. And we fell deeply, and we exploded along with the fire.
One of the points you make in the book is how utterly unprepared the government and the authorities were to cope with a disaster of this magnitude. What did you experience when you tried to get help from the government?
What we experienced was something that I now recognise pretty much communities across the Southern Hemisphere, and to some extent in the Northern Hemisphere in patches, are experiencing every time a catastrophe hits them. That there is an overwhelming focus by governments on economic development while completely denying the fact that there is a need for disaster preparedness. That means then that the bureaucracies have absolutely no briefing about what to do. They don't have any job sheet to go to when something happens, and they just bounce around for months, making things up as they go, and oftentimes getting it fundamentally wrong and further destroying lives that have already been torn apart. We had so much warning in this country. Our retired fire chiefs, we're a country that experiences fire every year. You know, this is the norm for us. Fire is a seasonal event here in Australia. And our fire chiefs, the retired ones, because they're the ones who can speak out to the media, warned the government for months with practically screaming at the media, screaming at the government to please pay attention, to please be prepared. And they were ignored and ridiculed and silenced by the government of the day. And that meant then that the bureaucracies did exactly the same thing when the event hit. They told us all that it wasn't as bad as we thought, that we would pick ourselves up and it would be fine, that they knew what they were doing, and they didn't. They didn't, and they don't still. We watched, in this country alone, we watched a flood happen, a major catastrophic flood happen within a year of the fires, and a repeat of all of the same mistakes. A year later, another flood, a repeat of all of the same mistakes. New Zealand has just seen the same thing. Mozambique, Malawi, Pakistan, Chile, Brazil, California, everywhere where the disasters are happening, government is absent. And that just leads me to believe that they don't plan to be prepared, that they are serving a different master, and it is not us.
Who is the other master? What is their objective?
Their objective is to consolidate as much monetary wealth as they can. And so that gives you an indication of who that master is. And I'm not speaking to conspiracies or anything about anyone specifically, but I am talking about the extreme wealthy elite and their consolidation of power and influence over politics. It dictates everything. It dictates how government budgets are distributed. It dictates what governments give their focus to. It dictates what they give approvals to. It dictates how prepared they're prepared to be. And they are not prepared to be prepared.
The agenda of the moneyed power is not compatible with a safe landscape. Is that what you're saying?
It would appear so, because the moneyed power wants access to more mines, it wants access to more ports, it wants access to more roads, And those things are considered by governments as more important than protecting the citizenry and protecting the natural landscape, even though it feels counterintuitive, because at the end of the day, that moneyed power is nothing without the general public as its workforce and its consumer. But they just seem hell-bent. And I have not gone into that in extreme detail, because that's the job of a particular kind of researcher that I don't have those skills to do. But it's just, you can feel it written all over every government policy, and you can feel it written in all of the decisions and all of the phone calls, all of the emails that you receive, and the face-to-face meetings with governments in the post-disaster space. It's sickening and desperately sad, because I feel deep concern for the next decade. My community went through it when all of this was still new and shocking, and because of that, we received a great deal of generosity from the general public around the world. There was an outpouring for at least a few months of care and concern for us. But as disasters build, that care and concern is waning. We saw it here in Australia. By the time the second flood had hit, it was lucky to even be in the media for more than 2 days. And people don't care anymore. The cities are just turning off their attention. And as the catastrophic events continue to escalate, I fear that more and more communities are going to be left high and dry. And those communities are the future. This is humanity we're talking about.
On the topic of community, in the absence of government response, you portray in your book coming together among the people of your rural area to help each other in the wake of the disaster. Could you talk about that community response that you experienced?
Yeah, and look, I also recognize that I live in not a unique community, but I live in a very fortunate community, in that we are a community that is accustomed to having to do things for ourselves. We are rural by nature, and therefore much more self-sufficient than many other communities in the world. So I recognize that we have skills and perhaps an awareness that isn't as cultivated elsewhere. But nonetheless, I think that we have some information to share, and we have some knowledge to share. So my community is, not surprisingly, a firefighting community, and it understands the nature of fire, and it understands what the aftermath of fire will be like. So while we were completely caught off guard by the scale of what we experienced, quite quickly we were able to recalibrate our brains to understand what it was that needed to happen. What we weren't prepared for, though, is the complete lack of government support. And so in the absence of that, we had to start gap filling in ways that we weren't expecting. We set up telephone trees to check in on people to make sure that they were still standing, and in fact, they were still alive. We didn't call it suicide watches at the time, but that's clearly what we were all doing. We were all checking in on each other, and I am acutely aware of a number of friends who would call me almost every week just to make sure that I was still moving. I was still walking forward. We had an outpouring of people prepared to come and help lift fences and remove burnt rubble. When you have to also understand that our emergency services are all volunteer. So there wasn't anyone around, that there wasn't any government agency around to come and clear the rubble or move burnt remains. It was all down to us as individuals. And we're a large island. It takes nearly 2 hours to drive from one side to the other, which I know is small. But we had friends that would drive every week for a full day from the other end of the island to us to help us with that process. Similarly, when we were having to rebuild infrastructure, other people turned up and just lifted buildings and lifted roofs and helped dig trenches. And all the while, what is happening is everyone is looking out for each other, because we also recognized quite quickly that it wasn't only the people who had lost their homes or their livelihood infrastructure, but our entire community had been shattered. Our entire community was in traumatic shock, and that we had to be careful for everyone, from children all the way up to our wise elders. And so there was a sense of collective embrace, despite our differences and despite the different ways we see the world. We were united, and that is a precious, precious thing to recognize. And that's, I think, my largest lesson, that in this globalized world where we all seek the community of people who think the way we think, that actually for survival in the face of climate change, the community you must connect with is the community where you live. And that means being prepared to embrace each other despite your differences, despite your beliefs. And that's hard, really hard. We had a natural disaster that pulled us together, but I really believe that that's the skill we need to cultivate going forward.
How many people are in the community that you're talking about?
4,200-ish. Yeah, it's a small community spread over an agriculturally dominated island. So my nearest neighbour is 10 kilometres from where I'm sitting right now. So people aren't directly next door. But what we can do is we can find intentional reasons to get together, and we're cultivating those now. We're making a point of meeting up once a month, not with our like-minded friends, not on surrounding the focus of something that we care about or we love. We're making points of getting together with the people who are closest to us, who live nearby, and just talking and sharing. And in those discussions, what we're discovering is that climate change is the thing that's binding us. Climate change has wiped away the differences. Climate change is now our connective link.
So there has been a big change in your relationship with the people around you, is what you're saying, that the disaster has wrought a transformation on the relationships that you experience where you live.
Yes, and it's not without its troubles. I'm not suggesting that it's utopia at all. It isn't, and we find people from outside will come in to hold a meeting about conservation or farming or whatever the issue is, mental health. And they come with their own very clear agendas. And as a community, we find ourselves sitting in these meeting spaces, being pulled now between that previous world that we would have immediately orientated to and the new world where we've crossed the line, where we recognize that the person we're sitting next to that lives down the road may hold a different worldview to us, but that the relationship with them is crucial, more important, in fact, than following the agenda of an outsider who is coming to tell us how things need to be. That doesn't mean that we don't still have to work through the really crucial things that are different between us, social welfare, access to medical knowledge, how we are going to protect nature, how we're going to fight the next fire, which we're all really quite frightened is going to happen sometime in the next 6 months. We still have to work through those things, but we fostered now a common vocabulary around climate change and climate awareness, which is helping us to navigate that. And we're learning to learn. We're learning to listen and learning to respect difference while still finding points of agreement. And it's humbling, if I'm honest. It's humbling for someone who has spent a career as an activist, which is by its very nature a very Boolean expression, right or wrong. It's humbling to have to exist in the grey zone.
And
Yeah.
what has caused this transformation is the realization that climate change poses a challenge to your community that all of you must meet together, it sounds like. Can you talk about what you believe is happening in the climate?
Well, I think that what we're seeing now is the very beginning of what we will be experiencing for the next 50 to 100 years. So despite what the world governments are negotiating in terms of emissions and emissions reductions, despite all of the well-meaning campaigns about getting business to be carbon neutral, all of those efforts, all of that mitigation effort is about the future. And it's about not making the future worse than what we will be experiencing in the next 30 to 50 years. That worse future could mean that humanity is completely gone. So the stakes are very high. And I'm not suggesting that mitigation work isn't vital. It is. But it's not about here and now. What's here and now is baked in. It's a consequence of what we didn't do 20 and 25 and 30 years ago when we first had the warning signs come out. Climate is a slow, lumbering beast, but it's beyond powerful. It's so, the scale of climate is so large that it eclipses humanity's ability to do anything about it. And what we are feeling right now is a result of those inactions 25 years ago or 30 years ago, where everything is getting amped up. And if it's getting amped up now, you can be sure that in 10 years, it's going to be double what we're experiencing now. So by amped up, I mean droughts are getting deeper and longer. Heat is becoming more intense. There is less relief. Water is drying up. And that's frightening. That should be the warning sign for all of humanity. I find it staggering that doesn't have us all, completely at attention, but water is drying up. Fire is becoming a capricious foe. It's fed by wind and moisture in ways that we never learned before. We didn't understand what it could become. We didn't understand what a pyrocume landscape could be like. Cyclones are becoming more intense. We've had heat domes, which we didn't even know existed before 2 years ago. Parts of the world that have thought a heat wave was 30 degrees Celsius have tipped over 50 degrees Celsius. Climate is biting hard, and the disasters that the storm-driven disasters that come from that, from the rain bombs, from the heat domes, from the firestorms, are going to be so much bigger. Cities will not protect people. The traditional means of constraining the impact won't protect people. We have to think radically differently from how we have in the past, and we need to make that incredibly localized. It needs to be adaptive for communities to be able to enact themselves, because there simply is not enough disaster relief force in the world to protect us. So we can't assume that there will be a rescue. We have to presume we have to be our own rescue.
This idea of being radically local is sort of your signature idea. You and I talked about it a year ago, I think.
Yeah,
Can you describe what radically local looks like?
certainly. Radically local, I think, is born of everything that I've just been saying about my growing relationship with my community and my understanding of needing to connect with people who are nearby, despite our differences and despite our different worldviews, because we are the ones that will stand against our next disaster. And for us, it will be another fire. That's a given for the landscape that we are in. We're very, very undulating, hilly country, so it's not going to be cyclones and floods. It will be fire. We have to, as a community, move past the point where we accept whatever it is that government tells us needs to be the way we manage that, which we're still having those conversations, and it frightens many people to think that government won't learn and what government will repeat what happened with the last disaster. But that, for me, that means we just have to take the whole situation in hand and make decisions ourselves. We have to do things that are very possibly illegal, and we need to coordinate them between us. So radically local to me means focusing your attention back on where you live and what is precious to you. For us, it's the natural landscape, and it's not just for the conservationists in our community. The natural landscape is why everyone lives here, farmers alike. We all love this place deeply and dearly. We recognise that in order for it to survive, it is going to require very, very different thinking on our behalf. We also need to, as a community, look to protecting ourselves and the assets that we need to survive, our food, our water, our shelter, and come up with methods for ensuring that they are here after the next firestorm, rather than having to rebuild them from scratch, because we probably don't have the emotional and physical energy to do it again. Well, certainly
When
not
you say, I'm sorry,
for another decade or so. You know, it's hard
when you
work.
say that you need to consider doing things that are
Mm.
illegal, that sort of makes me perk up, and that you need to
Yeah.
do it in concert. That it's like, what are you talking about? What is
Okay.
illegal that you and your neighbors need to do together?
Yeah. Well, government has this way of wanting to put laws around absolutely everything to protect everyone from the smallest bump or scrape, to ensure that no one goes out and does any big, terrible thing that erodes the conservation estate. So we have a lot of laws around what we're allowed to clear, how we're allowed to store our water, where pipes can run, where tracks can run, whether or not we're allowed to have more than 2 driveways out of our property, which is remarkable when you think about it. When you're a farm and you have, 1,000 acres along one road, the law says you may only have 2 driveways out of your property, which is a bit mad, right? So those fences will be cut. Those fences will be cut, and new access points will be bulldozed, regardless of the law. We will do cool season burns of bushland, regardless of the law, because that's what's going to save that bush from, or in American terms, forest, from the next catastrophic fire. We need to reduce the fuel load. We won't wait for the 2 years that it would take to get government approval. And I'm not kidding when I say 2 years for government approval. We'll do it when it needs to be done and when the time is right for our community and for that forest. We will probably store more water than we're allowed to do. We're restricted by how much water we can store in dams in this landscape and across most of Australia, because they don't want us taking too much water out of the natural river flows. And that's a law that's there for good reason. But we need that water now able to be accessed and directed to protect that very landscape. So I'm not talking about murdering people, and I'm not talking about stealing. I'm not talking about causing any harm to anyone, not those types of illegal actions. I'm talking about doing morally defensible illegal actions, things that are in the interests of the community and the landscape that we live in, regardless of what the law says to us. And I personally think that that is more important than chaining myself to the gates of an air terminal or a bulldozer. I think that activism needs to move to that radically local level now. I think that communities have to embrace doing what needs to be done, regardless of what government says, because government actually doesn't care about us at an individual level, nor at a community level. They've proven that again and again and again over the last 6 years. We just have to wake up to this fact. We're almost like we have Stockholm syndrome. We're just not quite aware of how little that concern is for our welfare. We are just numbers. And so if we are just numbers, then why not abandon it? Why not look to our local community where we are people and where the landscape is important and do what needs to be done? That's radically local.
How are things in your community? What is it, 2.5, 3 years later now? How are you recovering?
We're fragile still, I would say. Many of the homes have been rebuilt, not all. Some people have left because the threat is too big, and they have taken themselves back to the comparative safety of the city. Although, sadly, I don't know that that's any safer. I think that possibly here could be safer if you're prepared to put the work in. At least we understand what the foe is here. I'm not sure that I would want to go somewhere else and have to start again and not understand where that threat was. I and many in my community get comfort from the fact that we know what it is that we will face now, and we can imagine it scaling up. We can imagine it being bigger now. That blinker is gone, but we've had 2 years of high rainfall, which has been wonderful and a blessing because we haven't faced as many fires. We have had fire still, but not as many. And they've all been very small and very easily contained. But that rainfall means that we have an extreme amount of regrowth happen in most of our forested areas. And the scientists are telling us that with the change from La Nina to El Nino, next season is going to be very dry and very hot again. And I can feel people starting to clench and teeth starting to bite hard at the back of their mouths. You know, you can see tighter jaws and a haunted look creeping back into people's eyes. And I think a lot of that has to do with not the fire so much as whether or not we have the strength to rebuild, whether or not we can do it again. So there's fragility in that. And the suicide watch has just started again. Phone calls are beginning again. When we have lightning storms, suddenly your phone is full of text messages from people just checking in to see how you're doing. We're very much more aware of each other, and we're not better, but at least we're together. And for that, I'm massively grateful.
We're not better, but at least we're together. That could be the motto for the whole collapse acceptance movement.
Yeah.
I want to thank you, Margie. Congratulations on the publication of your book. Thank you for your vivid portrayal of a giant human disaster and for your looking to the future. And thank you for being here with me today.
Oh, thank you, David. Thank you. It really genuinely is an honor. This is such an important channel, and these are such important discussions, and I'm thrilled to be contributing something into them.
This has been Collapse Club. I'm David Baum in Seattle. Until we meet again, farewell.